Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fifth session of NCSE's course on science and language, overcoming controversy in the science classroom. I am Stephanie Keith, and with me is Minda Berbecco, who you'll see in just a minute. And so far in the course, you have heard from our director, Anne Reed, a little bit of an overview, and then Emily Shorting has gone into some specifics about language. And then last time, Anne and I talked about some misconceptions about the nature and processes of science. And today, Minda and I are going to be talking about specific content misconceptions related to climate change and evolution. And I'm going to let Minda take it from here.
Thanks. Thanks, Stephanie. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Okay, great. You want to go ahead and start advancing the slides? That'd be super. So if folks have questions, I'm going to be monitoring the questions throughout. So if I'm talking, I won't be able to necessarily answer your questions right away, but when Stephanie's talking, I certainly will. So if you are on a Google Hangout right now with us, on the left-hand side, there's a Q&A app that you can just click on. You may need to add or enable it if you don't already have it set up, but you can ask questions through that. You can also tweet us at NCSE Teach, or you can send me an email, and I'll be checking my email throughout the session at berbecco@ncsc.com. And I'll be monitoring throughout, and I'll stop when we have questions. So Stephanie talked a little bit about what we've been doing so far, but I'll give you a little bit more detail about that. So in the last time, we talked about some common misconceptions related to the nature and methods of science. So today we're going to get a little bit more in depth with that. We're going to talk about specific content misconceptions related to evolution and climate change. How we'll do that is we'll explain how content misconceptions form roadblocks to understanding. We're going to discuss a few of the most pervasive misconceptions about evolution and climate change, and we're going to explore strategies for recognizing and correcting them. So there's going to be a lot of nitty-gritty that we're discussing this week, and it's helpful if you have some of the background because we're not going to go into a lot of the basic stuff. So if at any point you're like, I'm not sure I fully understand what they're talking about, go ahead and pause this, or you can come back. This will be on YouTube, and go take a look at a couple websites that we think might be helpful. So Understanding Evolution has a really great refresher about evolution, basic evolutionary concepts. For climate change, NASA's Vital Signs of the Planet is excellent, and also the National Climate Assessment it's huge. There's a lot of information there, so a good place to start is just their FAQ that answers some pretty basic questions about climate change. So Stephanie, what is the big deal?
What is the big deal? So I have actually had this thought before I really got into working with NCSE, and we've certainly been asked it, which is why does NCSE single out climate change and evolution? Our goal is to make sure that these topics are, taught authentically and forthrightly and well, essentially, and that students understand these topics. But shouldn't that be true of all topics in science? And the answer is, of course, that's the goal. We have nothing against other areas of science. But it turns out that climate change and evolution really do require our specific attention. We're really concerned with misconceptions related to these topics because they are rife with conflict. At NCSE, we really don't like saying that these are controversial topics because scientifically they absolutely are not. The basic premise of evolution and that it happens and the basic mechanisms through which it happens. There is no conflict about that whatsoever. Climate change, again, there is overwhelming consensus that climate change is occurring and its primary cause is human impacts on the planet. No conflict in the science arena, but in society, there is. And as a result, there's a lot of community pressure. There's a lot of misunderstandings. There is just a lot, it's like a cloud that hangs over these two topics, and in part because they are also the target of some very well-funded and organized attacks. There are interest groups out there that really don't want people to accept and understand climate change and evolution. And as a result, they muddy the waters. They promote their denial by sowing doubt and confusion, and they do it very effectively, as we're going to see. And so as a result of all this community pressure and kind of noise and pollution surrounding these topics, we find that teachers often can't teach them in the same straightforward way that they can other topics of science. And in particular, that's what our goal is. Our goal is to make sure that these topics can be taught in the same way, up to the same standard that all science is being taught. And that, so today we're going to talk specifically about content misconceptions. And the reason that we're specifically concerned with misconceptions is, again, they sort of form points of weakness that can be exploited by these outside forces, which I know sounds very nefarious, but trust me, it's true, that have a vested interest in people continuing not to understand and accept evolution and climate change. So we want to make sure that these misconceptions aren't allowed to take root. We want to correct them so that students are better prepared to spot these targeted attacks and dismiss them, which is exactly what should happen. So let's talk about evolution first. I'm pretty sure that anyone giving a talk on evolution is required to show this quote. It's Theodosius Dobzhansky, and he said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution." And it's true. Evolution is the key to understanding pretty much everything in biology. If you don't understand evolution, ecology doesn't make sense. The human body doesn't make sense. Nothing really makes sense. So it's important, so important that students come away from their schooling with a very sound understanding of evolution. Even if they're not going to continue in science, it's just a core to understanding biology, and biology in turn is a big part of, decisions that these students who will then be citizens of the world are going to be making. So we really want them to understand it. But unfortunately, as I alluded to before, there are so many misconceptions around evolution. It can be very difficult, and it can be very difficult to understand it fully. Even if you think you understand it fully, it might turn out that you don't. A lot of the misconceptions that we're going to talk about today, you can hear them, you'll probably will see some of them in your textbooks. You will hear scientists say them, and it's not good. So really, a lot of what I do is trying to uproot these misconceptions. And if you're aware of them, then you can start to push back on them, and you can teach your students to do the same. So the first one we're going to talk about, here's this image. Chances are pretty good that if you asked your students to close their eyes and think of evolution, they would envision something like this. It's a little march from a gibbon-like creature on the left to a human on the right. And you'll see this all over the place. If you do a Google image search for evolution, I'm pretty sure you're mostly going to see images like this. What's wrong with it? Well, what's wrong with it is it pretty much summarizes our first misconception of the day, which is, by that image, it strongly suggests that evolution is linear and progressive, and evolution is not linear, and it is not progressive. Humans did not descend from chimpanzees. There's actually a lot of confusion around this, and we get asked more often than you'd think, if humans evolved from chimpanzees, then why are there still chimpanzees? Well, that's because humans did not evolve from chimpanzees. Humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor. Evolution is branching, it's sprawling, the analogy I like is a heavily pruned bush as opposed to a ladder. It does not march in one direction. And the idea of it being progressive, there's a sort of inherent desire to think that a human is somehow better or more evolved than a chimpanzee, and that is not true. Every organism that is alive on Earth today is equally evolved as each other. We've all can trace our ancestry back ultimately to the same point. And moreover, there's no yardstick for evolution. Humans pride themselves on our giant brains and our dexterous fingers and our ability to make music, and those are all wonderful things. But if you're an octopus, you're pretty proud of the fact that you can camouflage, that you can squeeze yourself into even the smallest space. And that's great too. There's nothing that says that our big brains is somehow better than an octopus's camouflage. There's no yardstick by which you can say something is better than another thing. So that's the first misconception to look out for, and you'll hear it all the time. You have to listen for subtle clues from your students that they have this misconception, and make sure that they don't think that one thing morphs into another via evolution. Reinforce that it's branching, and watch out for them saying that something is more evolved than something else or better than something else, because that's not true either. Second misconception, evolution. Everyone's seen this. You probably recognize it. It's the classic example of natural selection. It's the peppered moth from England. The story basically is, originally, the peppered moth, there were two kinds, a white form and a black form. The white ones blended in very nicely with the tree, which made the black ones easy prey for birds. And then things got all sooty and gross in the Industrial Revolution, and suddenly the black moths had a huge advantage, and the white moths became easy prey, and there's a huge shift in the distribution of that trait over the population. It's natural selection. Everybody loves natural selection. If you cover only this, have you covered all of evolution? If you're thinking yes, think again. All evolution does not occur by natural selection. Evolution and natural selection are not synonyms. Evolution is a specific form of change. It's change in the genetic makeup of a population over generations. And one way that that happens is by the mechanism of natural selection. That was Darwin's idea, and it's one way by which evolution works, but there are others. Moreover, evolution was around. The idea of evolution goes way back before Darwin. Thinkers as far back as ancient Greece were writing and thinking about evolution. So there's a temptation, you hear this a lot, to make evolution all Darwin. People call it Darwinism, and they'll say that, you know, like the people who are anti-evolution will talk about Darwin all the time. Darwin just came up with a really good explanation for one of the mechanisms. Evolution exists beyond Darwin, outside of Darwin. That's not to say that you shouldn't be covering Darwin, because of course you should. I've said before, and I will say it again, that if I were on a desert island and only got to pick one mechanism of evolution to take with me, I would take natural selection. But it's important not to give your students the impression that that's the only way that evolution occurs, even if it's not part of your curriculum. And the ways you do this is by just saying exactly that you're going to focus on natural selection, which is a very important mechanism that by which evolution occurs, but there are others. And if you don't mention the others, that's fine, but just don't let your students get the impression that everything is the result of natural selection, or else they'll start to think that everything is adaptive. Everything is an adaptation, and that's not true. And if you doubt me, look up the function of your belly button. There isn't one. In case you're wondering, these are the other mechanisms of evolution: plain old mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow. And I am pretty confident that when you're teaching a unit on evolution, you cover all of these things, even if you don't give them a name. The story of Darwin's finches involves all of these mechanisms in addition to natural selection. So you're probably doing it already. Third misconception: what's wrong with this sentence? Polar bears evolved warm coats because they needed them to survive in the Arctic. If you asked your students, why do polar bears have warm coats? How many of them do you think would give you an answer like that? My guess is a fair few. The problem is that is not true. Evolution does not ensure that organisms get what they need. It is a process. It's not a guiding hand. Evolution acts on available variation only. You don't get your naked polar bear hanging out in the Arctic wishing for a good fur coat. That's not what happened. Instead, there were bears, they had fur coats, and ones with slightly thicker coats survived more often and had more offspring than bears with thinner coats. And they passed that trait on to their offspring, and over generations and generations, you get the lovely fur coat that polar bears have today. And it's very tempting. This misconception is intuitively satisfying. You see these marvelous adaptations, and it just seems like, well, of course they have it because they need it. If they didn't have those fur coats, they couldn't live in the Arctic. So that makes perfect sense, but that's just not how it works. And it's so important that you get that across to your students. There is no need, no want, and no try when it comes to evolution. But here's a big caveat. That does not mean that evolution is random. Evolution is not entirely random either. There are random elements. Mutation is a random process. So there's certainly, and some environmental change can be random as well. So there are random components to evolution. Natural selection, that particular mechanism, is not random. In a given environment, you can make predictions about who will survive better than others. But it's always kept a little bit off balance by the random components. So the end result is that evolution, particularly evolution by natural selection, but really all evolution, is neither completely random nor completely non-random. It has components of both. Now, speaking of our friends up in the Arctic and their fur coats that are so well suited, take a look at this. This is a screenshot from an interactive activity in a very prominent museum. And it says, it basically is asking you, how will your body evolve if the temperature rises? Will you get more sweat glands? Will you get a tall, narrow body like a giraffe? So this misconception is on display right here. This makes it seem like if there all of a sudden is a new need, my body will respond and give me one of these two options. And that is not true. And it's particularly dangerous in this case because now we're crossing over our bridge into climate change here. But this gives the impression that if climate change is true, in the it says, if you actually look below the red and green timeline, far, far into the future, if temperatures get warmer, oh, it'll be no big deal. I'll just get what I need. My body will do something amazing. And that is not how it works. And with that, now we're talking climate change, I'm going to pass it back to Minda.
Thanks, Stephanie. So that's a really good point. There's a couple things about that, and I don't want to spend too much on this one graphic, but there's that element to it that, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the future as well, but, we can just, everything will adapt and you'll become, you'll just have more sweat glands or you'll become bigger or whatever. It's not exactly how it works. And also the other element is that climate is changing far, far in the future and not that it's changing right now. So that's also a misconception about climate change. So what are some common misconceptions about climate change? Well, there are quite a few. So I'm just going to focus on a few here. But if you're interested, you can certainly go check out skepticalscience.com because they break down the top 10 and then they get into some nitty gritty of other ones. So I chose a couple from their top 10. Number 2 on their list of popular misconceptions or climate myths, as they call them, is it's the sun. So it's not greenhouse gases that are causing climate change. It's not human activity. It's actually just the sun's activity. So you have to understand that when you're addressing this climate myth or this misconception, you're really going against what seems like common sense. So think about, what we understand about, our basic interactions with things that are hot, right? The sun is a giant flame to us here on Earth. And if you are in your kitchen and you turn on the stove and you turn it up, well, it gets hotter. If you turn it down, well, it gets cooler. So how is it possible that the sun isn't just being turned up? And if the sun's being turned up, well, then it must get hotter here. And vice versa, if the Earth is getting warmer, well, it must just be because of the sun. Go ahead, Stephanie. Thank you. So there's a couple ways to address this this myth or this misconception, and they really get into the nitty gritty and the understanding of how climate works. And this gets into some pretty complex ideas. So it's not something that you can really answer quickly with somebody, but if someone understands this and they really have a deeper understanding about a lot of Earth systems. So the first question that you really need to answer is the sun solely responsible for climate on Earth? And of course, the answer is no, it's not just the sun. The sun obviously is very important, but other things impact climate. And these include greenhouse gases and greenhouse effect, ocean currents. And I have a what else, because there's quite a bit of other things that you can fill in there as well. So that sort of tackles that question. The second question you want to ask is, okay, has anyone looked at the sun's activity? And it would be silly if nobody had. And in fact, we do. We monitor the sun's activity. And we've seen that over time, yes, the sun's activity does vary, but it's not coinciding with the global surface temperature increases. So these are things that people do include, scientists do include in their models and their analysis. It's not something that people are ignoring, certainly. But by looking at this and asking this question, you have the opportunity to really get a deeper understanding of the climate system. Go ahead, Stephanie. Thank you. So another myth on this, which goes right back to what Stephanie was just talking about, is that, well, even if it is happening, who cares? Animals and plants can just adapt. And hey, humans can too. But based on what you just heard about evolution, what do you think about this? This ties strongly to the misconception that evolution ensures that organisms just get what they need. So that polar bear with the fur coat can just be like, I'm cold, I need a fur coat. And it also ties a little bit into magical thinking. You know, it's just poof, this can fix everything. And really, that's not how biological systems work. So an example that I really like is from the Audubon Society, and they have a wonderful website where they've done a lot of analysis on the impacts of climate change on birds in the US, and they've split it up into these different flyways. And if you go there, I definitely recommend spending some time on it because it's actually quite interesting. But I'll give you one example that I took from their analysis. So I chose the Mississippi Flyway, and I'm focusing on Iowa in particular. And I chose the ring-necked duck, which you can see a picture of the ring-necked duck right there. And if you look at these two maps here that are set up, on the left-hand side is a map of their winter and summer range in the year 2000. So pretty close to now. And then the map on the right is their winter and summer range in the year 2080. So that's off in the future, about 70 years from now, 65 years from now. So that's quite a ways in the future, but what do you notice? Well, the first thing you probably notice is, gosh, there's a whole lot more blue, and that's their winter range. So their winter range is expanding, and if you're in Iowa, you might actually notice that, like, hey, there's more ducks here in the winter time, and like, what's the problem? And if you're even further north, in an area where you really don't see them in the winter, you might start noticing them in the winter. So you might think that these ducks are doing awesome. But look at their summer range. So their summer range is really becoming much smaller. And of course, this is going to have an impact on birds that depend on a summer habitat to have their babies and really spend a lot of time there. And so all of a sudden their habitat is disappearing. What is the impact going to be? So this kind of goes into the whole, well, just because in one way, an organism might be benefiting from some changes, you have to look at the whole system and all the changes that are happening. And this also can give you a really deeper understanding of both the abiotic and biotic systems that you're working in. So where do these misconceptions come from? They come from a couple different places. We've been focusing a lot on the genuine misunderstandings, and these come from these are preconceptions students come into the classroom with. A lot of us carry these preconceptions around, or these misconceptions around. So really, there's good ways of tackling that, which we've sort of talked about so far. There's an element of distrust of science or scientists, and Stephanie and Anne talked about this in the last session a little bit. And also, Stephanie pointed out I should definitely mention that NCSE has a program specifically designed to address this, bringing scientists into classrooms to work with teachers and their students to talk about climate change and evolution and try to build a little bit of those partnerships. But that can be certainly a distrust of science, or scientists can certainly be an element. And a lot of it just has to do with again, what Stephanie pointed to in the last session, how many people actually know a scientist? How many people can name a scientist? And this feeling that they're this very separate entity. And then there's the concern for moral implications, which differ for evolution and climate change. For evolution, it tends to be of a religious basis. For climate change, it could be a couple different things. It could be a political element where it's like, well, are you saying that I'm bad because I'm driving a car, and very resistant in that way? We see that a lot. Or it could just be also oh my gosh, this is horrible. If I admit that this is happening, um, I'm in real trouble. Everyone's in real trouble. And so that can actually get in the way of really trying to understand what's going on in the science. And the last one, with disillusionment and despair, really ties a lot into climate change, because it can be really depressing and very negative. And so it's kind of easier to believe it's the sun, because then we don't have to do anything about it, than a reality of the human actions causing something so distressing as climate change.
So I talked a little bit before about some of these outside interests and who are sowing the confusion and the doubt and trying to promote denial. And I said they've been very successful. And here are just a couple of statistics from recent polls that give you a sense of the kind of uphill battle we're facing. In 2013, a Gallup poll found that 42% of Americans think that God created humans in their present form just 10,000 years ago. So nearly half. And the question's a little bit problematic because it conflates human evolution, which some people are willing to accept evolution, just not for humans. But still, that's not a good statistic. And then in 2015, just last year, from a Yale poll, 41% of Americans think that climate change is caused by natural processes or that it isn't happening at all. And then only 12% had an idea of the consensus, how strong the consensus is. In actuality, 97% of scientists agree that climate change is happening because of human activity, and only 12% selected the ballpark of 80 to 100%. So these misconceptions are out there in force in every community, and your students come in with them. You yourself might have had them and not realized it. So it's an uphill battle, but it's an important one to fight. And in this next section, we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that these misconceptions are exploited. And the first one, this is from a blog post. Kent Hovnid, who is a big guy in the creationism movement, he wrote this essay called "The Possum, the Redwood Tree, and the Kidney Bean, a spoof on evolution theory." And if you read it through, I won't read the whole thing, but it says the theory of evolution teaches that living things are becoming more complex as time progresses. Hopefully, right now, you're thinking, no, it doesn't, because that was from our first misconception. But it goes on to basically say, so, okay, chromosomes are the most complex bits of matter, and so it seems logical to assume that organisms with the least number of chromosomes were the first ones to evolve, and then things got more complex, so you added chromosomes, and then he makes a chart. On the left, you see the chart, and if you look down, there's 3 22s circled, and that's the possum, the redwood tree, and the kidney bean. And he says, from this chart, it's obvious that we all started off as penicillin with only 2 chromosomes, and then we slowly evolved into fruit flies. Then after many millions of years, we turned into tomatoes or houseflies and so on until we reached the human stage with 46. One of our ancestors must have been one of the identical triplets, a possum, a redwood tree, a kidney bean with 22 chromosomes each. So that's ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense because it's not true. But he's exploiting this misconception that evolution is linear and progressive. And if you're caught unaware, this can sound pretty good. This argument against evolution makes sense to a lot of people. And what we need to do is to make sure that your students aren't among them. Because if you are among them, then you look at this and you say, oh my God, evolution doesn't make any sense. I didn't come from a redwood tree. No, of course you didn't. Okay, so, but it's important that they be able to recognize this for what it is right away. Here's another one. This is an ad that was placed in 2001 by the Discovery Institute, which is a huge, I think they call themselves a belief tank. So it's like a think tank, but without facts, I guess. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, Discovery Institute, they're the organization behind intelligent design and all of that hoopla that it caused. And they put this ad out. And it was a full-page ad, a scientific dissent from Darwinism. It was in a number of reputable publications. And in the middle there, it says, "We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life." Well, I am too, because that doesn't fully account for the complexity of life, because there are other mechanisms of evolution. But if you didn't know that, then you'd say, yeah, that doesn't, you're right, it can't explain everything, because it truly can't, but no one's claiming that it can. But they go on to say that you need careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. And then it says public TV programs, this was right after the PBS Evolution series came out. They say that all known scientific evidence supports Darwinian evolution, as does virtually every reputable scientist in the world. But we scientists dispute the first claim and stand as living testimony in contradiction to the second. And what they're saying is that they don't agree that Darwin's theory of evolution fully explains the complexity of living things. Again, I don't fully agree. I don't agree with that either. But unfortunately, they didn't pull this ad out to make sure that everyone's teaching genetic drift and gene flow. They want people to think that evolution, which they're conflating with Darwinism, natural selection, they want people to question that and to bring in lessons on intelligent design. So, and they had 100 scientists sign it, or I should say PhDs in a science or related field. In response, NCSE started Project Steve, which we had people with PhDs in science or MDs. They had, if your name was Steve or some form thereof, Stephanie, Stefan, etc., then you could sign our petition talking about what we do know about evolution. And to date, we've got well over almost 1,400 scientists, and we think that a Steve accounts for about 1/100th of the population. So we vastly outnumber them. But the point here, again, is the misconception on display is that all evolution occurs via natural selection, and it doesn't. Okay, so, but again, if you didn't know that, if you couldn't just say, of course it doesn't, then this, again, might seem tempting. Finally, this was from a blog by another creationist in 2014 called "The Assumption Behind the Theory of Evolution." And it says, "So how did evolution know to make the heart out of these special myocardial cells in order for it to function as a pumping mechanism? How did evolution know to even such cell connections by electrical synapses for such action potentials that organisms could absolutely need in order to survive?" And then it goes on. Of course, the answer is not in the knowing, but in the assumption that with enough time, anything is possible. Indeed, how could evolution know anything since it's a bogus theory of blind, unintelligent, random causes? Now, cells can't act of their own free will to form a heart. That is right. That sounds ridiculous. But that's not how evolution works. Evolution is not entirely random. And the evolution on display here, that organisms, evolution gives organisms what they need to survive, that evolution is entirely random. It's all muddled in here. So by the time you got to the end of this paragraph, you might find yourself agreeing with it. Like, yeah, that is ridiculous. Well, it is, but that's also not how evolution's working. And the authors of these types of things are banking on you not having a firm grasp of how evolution truly works. All right, Minda, you're up with our very best friend, Senator Inhofe.
Oh, thank you. So tying into what Stephanie's saying, what's the big deal with this? What is the impact? And so one of the ones that is a very basic misconception, even before the sun, in terms of misconceptions regarding climate change, or in general even, is weather and climate are the same. So it goes into the whole, well, it was warm outside today, but it was cold yesterday, and the weatherman never really knows if it's going to rain or not, and we can't really tell what the weather's like. How could we even make any assessments about climate? And similarly, if a senator ends up with a snowball coming in to work and showing it around, does that mean the climate isn't changing? So this idea that cold weather disproves climate change, and obviously we know that that's not true. And what's really interesting, obviously, is that students learn about the differences between weather and climate really early. We're talking oftentimes kindergarten, if not a little bit later, like second grade, but we're talking elementary school. And yet it's a common misconception, so common that it seems appropriate for a politician to come in and talk about it and confuse people. So as a result, there was quite a bit of news this past year where 2015 was the hottest year on record. But then, of course, there was a news story from Forbes, and I shouldn't even say it's a news story, excuse me, it was an opinion piece because it was not a news story, it wasn't reporting anything, but it was an opinion piece in which someone actually said, well, no, it wasn't. And so all of a sudden you're bringing in someone's opinion as opposed to all the data that you have showing that, yes, in fact, it was. And so the misconception ties into, oops, we were wrong. Whew, what a relief. And takes advantage of the developing nature of science and data collection as well. And so that's really common too. I mean, I think that's something that came up in the conversation, if not last time, the time before, with Anne talking about, well, with nutrition, there's always countering advice. So, therefore we can't believe anything. And that's really not true. And in this case, it was actually someone's opinion versus actually the data and the evidence that demonstrated that 2015 was the hottest year on record. So what's the best way to root out content misconceptions? This can sometimes be hard because when you hear them, you want to immediately jump all over the person or jump all over the data or what have you, and try to just really get them to understand. But first, you got to stop and you have to ask some questions. You have to ask, well, what do you mean by that? Or what do you mean by what you just said? If that's true, then what would happen if? What do you think of that? What's your evidence for it? And what's your evidence is one that I use a lot because it helps me figure out where they're coming from. And even in the case where I've actually said, can you send me that? Can you send me that article? Because I'm not sure I'm fully understanding what you're pointing to. And then all of a sudden you're able to actually see where these misconceptions are coming from and point people in the right direction. I think it's important, particularly because we had so much of a discussion with Emily about the value of language, that making sure that we're really aware of our language usage. So you want to make sure that you're asking the questions to get information you need to know, whether they get it or not.
I'm just going to jump in if I can, Linda.
Sure.
So I get asked a lot because I do a lot of workshops on this evolution stuff, and even more detailed than what we've talked about tonight. And we'll say things like, okay, so it's not that the polar bear didn't evolve a warm coat so that it could survive, but rather, the warm coat enabled the polar bear to survive. And sometimes I'll hear back like, no, that's just so picky, and why, like, it's just the language of my students, and you can't expect them to have such precise language. But my argument to them is that unless you ask questions, you're not going to know if they truly understood what you were talking about or not. So if someone says to you, if one of your students said to you, the peppered moths, they needed to be black so that they could survive and reproduce, do they really understand how evolution works? They understand how natural selection works. And so unless you can follow up with some questions and say, well, they, did all the, I'm trying to think of questions off the top of my head, but you need to get them to rephrase that. What do you mean by need? And you might find that they think that the white moth can turn itself black, that, that evolution is happening within one generation. Or you might find, that some other kind of misconception that you can uncover. And unless you get to that, then you're not going to be sure that they've mastered a concept. And so being particular with the language, I'd argue, is worth the time and is worth the effort.
Thanks, Stephanie. So just to finish this off, and I'm sure Stephanie will have some thoughts on this as well, but what is the best way to correct these content misconceptions? Well, really lead with the questions and evidence and ask for conclusions. Showing students the data and ask them to reconcile their ideas with the data presented. So a lot of times, an example for climate change, what I talk a lot with teachers and what they tell me is that they don't even start a session saying, hey, we're going to talk about climate change today. They actually show them, bring data to the class and have students really work through that data, and then ask them questions about it and say, well, I got this data from NASA. What does this mean? And from there, they can see for themselves, oh my goodness, temperature is rising. Oh my goodness, CO2 levels are rising, those kinds of things. And start making those connections themselves. And that way, they have a deeper knowledge of what's going on and they have a better understanding of the processes involved. Stephanie, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I would, when it comes to evolution, just something I can think of now, if you have a feeling that students have the misconception, for example, that chimpanzees turned into humans, kind of blow that out. Say, okay, well, what did we learn about amphibians? Where did the first amphibians come from? And they evolved from fish, from a group of fish. Okay, so does that mean that there are no fish anymore? And if multicellular organisms evolve from single-celled organisms, are there no longer single-cell organisms? Get them to sort of take their micro misconception and blow it up and see it bigger. And I think that can really help sort of see, oh, okay, so this is the same thing. No, okay, so humans evolved from a group. Okay, I get it. And then they'll sort of be able to move on. That's the hope anyway.
That's great. Well, I think that's it for us. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining me for this.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, you're welcome to get in touch with us at NCSC. Have a good night.